All right, Mike is looking longingly at the light switch, so it must be time to start. We're still in 1 Corinthians chapter 10. I make no promises, but I would like to finish this chapter tonight, so we can get on into chapter 11. We're right at the end of our of question 17. All right, let's begin with a word of prayer. Our Father in heaven, thank you so very much for the good day you've given us today and for the blessings we've enjoyed at your hand. We're thankful for another time to assemble together and to join our hearts and minds in a study of your word. We pray that you will bless us and guide us, that we might learn the lessons that are here for us, and that you'll continue to be with those who are unable to be with us here tonight. We love you. We thank you most of all, Father, for Jesus and for the sacrifice that he made on our behalf and for the presence and promises that he's made for us. And it's in his name that we pray. Amen. So Paul has basically said there in verse 21, you can't drink the cup of the Lord and the cup of demons. You can't partake of the table of the Lord and the table of demons. It's just not allowed. And the question we're on in question 17, which is in verse 22, what will be the result if they try that? If they decide they're going to do it anyway. And so Paul answers that with a couple of rhetorical questions. Shall we provoke the Lord to jealousy, or will we continue to try to eat at both meals and thus arouse the Lord's jealousy against us, like Israel had? I mean, that's the context there. And then the second rhetorical question is, are we stronger than he is? And again, as with all rhetorical questions, it's an obvious answer. And Paul is actually asking, you certainly don't intend to think or say that you're stronger than the Lord, that you could think you could get away with that. The warning of God's jealousy is something you can't challenge. If you can't go up against him. So all along here, as they have in the previous times, and then probably in Paul's visit, that was the miserable one that he made, and the first letter that he wrote to them that we don't have, and this response here that he's answering now, seems that they are insisting on their right to eat these pagan meals in the temples, because, well, there's only one God and food doesn't matter. And Paul's stating very clearly here that that's idolatry. You're putting God to the test. Again, as I pointed out at the end of the lesson last week, this may seem to be disjointed and confusing, and that Paul's taken kind of a meandering point to get here. But again, it's perfectly clear to the Corinthians. They're the ones that have had interaction with him. It was their letter he's responding to. So they know exactly what he says. And Paul's going to point out, we're going to get right back into this idea of liberties here in verses 23 down through the end. There are things that are liberties and matters that are of indifference to God. Things perhaps even that are tangentially idolatrous, like you're buying meat that came from a temple in a marketplace. So Paul still is going to speak about rights and freedoms, but I mentioned right at the end of class last week that part of the issue that we have with this teaching is because we've come out of we are in Western civilization, having come out of the Enlightenment, and the whole Enlightenment, for a number of reasons, the idea of the miraculous, the idea of the spirit world, and that whole realm is, that's fables and myths, and people don't really believe that. And I mentioned that people in China have had to fight this. In fact, last Thursday night, I was talking to, because Misako's in my Thursday night class, and they have the same thing in Japan. They have the ancient ancestors, I should say, that they worship once a year and make sacrifices to, and so things demonic are not just in people in the past. They're still around us, and even if we don't admit it, it's still around us. What did Paul say? Our fight is not with who? Not with flesh and blood, but with the powers that are around us. Still there. That's still our fight. And we can't be ostriches and stick our head in the ground and pretend that those things don't exist. Participating in pagan meals and pagan temples is idolatry. Now, marketplace food is a different thing. And apparently Paul has participated in that. If you go back to 1 Corinthians, the 9th chapter, which in my Bible is just right across the page here, for though I am free from all, I've made myself a servant to all that I might win the more. And so as he's talking about to those outside the law, he became like that, or to the Gentiles. But what that tells me is that when he was in Gentiles' house and they were eating that meat, he ate with them. And he seems to have been judged for that. I think the Corinthians are thinking, well, you're saying you can do this, and you're saying we can't do that, and they're the same thing. And he's saying, no, they're not. Chapter 9 and verse 3, this is my defense to those who would examine me. So that's what they're doing. They're saying that he shouldn't be doing that. In chapter 10 and verse 29, he's going to talk about that as well, about the conscience and the liberties that are there. And we'll talk about that hopefully tonight. So the Corinthians, like us at times, have a difficult time distinguishing what is absolute and what is a matter of indifference. And studying what Paul says in this section of 1 Corinthians chapter 8 through 10 and what he said in Romans chapter 14 is important, and we need to be careful with our exegesis of those texts and understand them the way the people that received it understood it. But as Paul has been saying all along, it's not just a question of knowledge and rights. It's a question of love and freedom. And if I have the freedom to do something, it doesn't mean I have to do it or even need to do it. If love cancels that and the need for others. So, love and freedom lead to edification and the benefit to others. Rights and knowledge end up in destruction of others, oftentimes. So question 18, what slogan of the Corinthians does he repeat here in verse 23? All things are lawful, and but all those things aren't helpful, and all things are lawful, but not all things edify. And
I'm wondering, are you suggesting that there was all those things, or was there was all things are lawful?
No, the but all things are not helpful is Paul's response to that. Yeah, so the all things are lawful both times that's their slogan. But Paul said, yeah, it may be, but that doesn't mean it's helpful. That doesn't mean that it edifies, which should be the basis upon which we make decisions about doing lawful or things that are indifferent. And where he wrote that before is in chapter 6 and verse 12. And the insistence of the Corinthians on their exousia, their right, their authority to do these things is still a loose end. In their minds, again, in light of Paul's right to eat this food that's been purchased in a marketplace and eaten somewhere else, that seems to be to them a contradiction. So Paul's not going to make here a defense of his own actions in addressing that. What he's going to share with them is what his attitude is toward this food. And to encourage them, as he's going to get right to the end of this chapter, to imitate him, to accept his way of looking at it as their model. Imitate me as I imitate Christ. Which, listen, you can't get a better model than that. You're going to imitate Christ. So, and the nice thing about them is if Paul is imitating Christ and Christ isn't there, when they're imitating Christ, or Paul, they're seeing Christ. This should be the same for us. People, when they see us, if Christ is living in us, they should be seeing, it's like the old expression that I remember people poo-pooing, which is, what would Jesus do? That's a great rule of thumb. I mean, you can't get better than that if you live by that. So question 19, what is the standard of behavior that all Christians should follow according to verse 24? Okay, so you have this freedom, this right to do whatever that is. Are there any qualifications to control you in being involved in that, or fulfilling that, or following through on that right? And again, it doesn't matter in Paul's mind here what it is in this realm of disputable matters, and it's the Greek word. Let me see, I have it here. Right, we're back on. There we go. So I just asked the question, with regard to disputable matters, if something is a matter of indifference, is it a matter of indifference to everybody? And the answer to that is no. Some people are going to say it matters and other people don't. And so the way to differentiate the nature of doing things we think is allowed is, and this is just kind of a good rule of thumb, must I do this to please God? Question 1. Is what I'm wanting to do, must I do that to please God? And secondly, is it necessary to please God? If it's not, then it's probably a matter of indifference. So, If the answer is no, then it's a matter of indifference. On the other side, looking at it from the other point, will doing this displease God? And if it does displease God, what's the answer to that? Don't do it. Don't do it. So that's the standard of behavior here, is we're not going to seek our own good, but the good of our neighbor. And this is a not but verse. Not but. Let me give you a couple, and you guys can turn to them. 1 Peter 2:18. 1 Corinthians 1:17. 1 John 3:18. There's three examples. And when you have, in most cases, and it's not every case, but whenever you have a not but in the New Testament, you can generally put in two words, not only, but also. Okay? So who's got 1 Peter 2:18? Okay, John?
Slaves, submit yourself to your masters with all respect, not only to those who are good and considerate, but also to those who are harsh.
See, so they put it in. The translators put it in for you there. Not to please your masters, but also. Not just, but also. First, or maybe that's the way it is in all of it. 1 Corinthians 1:17. Okay, Cindy?
For Christ sent me not to baptize, but to preach the gospel, not with wisdom of words, lest the cross of Christ should be made of none effect.
Okay, so Christ sent me not to, or read it again. Just read the first part of that.
For Christ sent me not to baptize, but to preach the gospel.
Okay, so stop right there. Was Paul sent to baptize? Yes. What's the Great Commission? Go to all the world and preach the gospel to every creature, doing what? Baptizing them. But it's not just baptizing. He didn't send me just to go baptize people, but also to preach the gospel. 1 John 3:18. Okay, Tim?
Dear children, let us not love with words or speech, but with actions and in truth.
Okay, so let's not love with words of speech. All right? I'm never saying I love you again. Not only, but also. So don't let my love just be shown in words, but also in my actions. So again, most of the time when you see that not but, it's going to be not only but also. And that's what he's talking about here as well. Let no one seek his own good, but the good of others. Not just your own good, but also the good of others. And listen, that's Philippians chapter 2 and verse 4 in different words. Let me go back here. Where Paul said, let each of you look not only to his own interest, but also to the interests of others. So there it's added there. So freedom does not mean to seek my own good. That's not what freedom, and listen, that's how our society looks at freedom. I'm going to do what makes who happy? Me. Okay? And that's not what that is about here. It means to be free in Christ in a way that I can seek the benefit and edification of other people. Okay? That's where my true freedom lies. That I can do things that are going to be beneficial to other people. And just because I may do something is not the freedom to do that thing without consideration or thought of others. Okay? Yes, John?
This is also a maturity thing too, I think, because here he is a very strong Christian.
Right.
If he goes amongst a bunch of people who are not nearly as strong as he is, and goes amongst the people who are regularly visiting pagan temples, regularly eating meat sacrificed to idols, he knows that it doesn't matter to him because of his maturity, but what does he have to do for the sake of the people he's trying to teach?
Right.
He's trying to bring them out of the world.
Right.
He's trying to make them understand you're with God now. There's one
Right.
way to go. Stick with it.
Right.
And I think that's part of what you're talking
Right.
about. Is
Well, and what he's trying to get them to also see is, it's not just Paul towards them, it's them towards those that are weaker among them.
Yep.
You know, it's, if I see a little kid and he's wanting to stick a paper clip into a wall outlet,
Teaching them to observe all.
yeah, and so I keep him from doing that. Is it going to kill him if he does that? A 110 volt, is that going to kill him? No. But I don't want him to go stick it in a 220 or some other thing, you know. And so I know not to do it, and I'm trying to help him not to do it. And that's what basically Paul, because I don't tell the child, don't do that, it's going to kill you. I just say, don't do it. I don't want you to do it. I don't want you to trip breakers. I don't want all kinds of things that can happen. I don't want you to do that. And what Paul is saying is, eating these meals in pagan temples is wrong. It's idolatry. And now he's trying to get them to see that not all the meat that comes out of those places is bad, but having it there in that context with other idolaters, you are trying to eat at the table of demons and drink the cup of demons, and at the same time eat at the table of the Lord and drink the cup of the Lord, and you cannot do that. It's not allowed. And so even if they are thinking, which they ought not to by now, but that I may still do that, well then, here's another layer of things that you have to go through before you participate in that. Any comments on that? Because now we're getting right into the other side of this. What does Paul say about eating meat purchased at the marketplace in verses 25 through 27? So let's go ahead and read that. Eat whatever is sold in the meat market without raising any questions on the ground of conscience. For the earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof. And then if one of the unbelievers invites you to dinner and you are disposed to go, eat whatever is set before you without raising any question on the ground of conscience. So, if this is the first time you've read this verse in the context of what we just saw, you might be kind of taken aback, because we're ready for Paul to give illustrations of forbearance and to always have other people in mind. And so, because there might be some Corinthians there would have an issue with you buying the meat in the marketplace and taking it home and eating it. Might there be some Corinthians that would have an issue with that? Yeah, because they can't separate anything that has to do with that temple from the God. And that's just, they grew up in it, and they have that feeling. And so Paul here, kind of along the lines of Romans 14:13 through 23, and I hate doing this. I hate going back and forth because the Corinthians didn't have Paul's letter to Romans. But I want to read this to you real quick. Starting in verse 13. Therefore, let us not pass judgment on one another any longer, but rather decide never to put a stumbling block or hindrance in the way of a brother. I know and am persuaded in the Lord that nothing is unclean in and of itself, but it is unclean for anyone who thinks it's unclean. For if your brother is grieved by what you eat, you are no longer walking in love. By what you eat, do not destroy the one for whom Christ died. So do not let what you regard as good be spoken of as evil. For the kingdom of God is not a matter of eating and drinking, but of righteousness and peace and joy in the Holy Spirit. Whoever thus serves Christ is acceptable to God and approved by men. So then let us pursue what makes for peace and for mutual upbuilding. Do not, for the sake of food, destroy the work of God. Everything indeed is clean, but it is wrong for anyone to make another stumble by what he eats. It is good not to eat meat or drink wine or do anything that causes your brother to stumble. The faith that you have, keep between yourself and God. Blessed is the one who has no reason to pass judgment on himself for what he approves. But whoever has doubts is condemned if he eats, because the eating is not from faith. Whatever does not proceed from faith is sin. So, instead of Paul doing that and giving us all of that information here, instead he gives us two concrete examples of personal freedom with regard to meat in the meat market. So he doesn't give us Romans 14:13 through 23. He doesn't give the Corinthians that. He gives them something else. He gives them two real-life examples of how to take care of this. And these are going to be defended rhetorically in the end of verse 29 and 30, for why should my liberty be determined by someone else's conscience? If I partake with thanksgiving, why am I denounced? Etc., etc. So we're going to get an expression of concern, obviously, from Paul. And why he is doing this here is that freedom is just that. Freedom is not only the ability to do something, it's also the ability to do what? Yeah, to not do it. Freedom is freedom. And in matters of indifference, you're free to do it and you're free not to. You don't have to do that. And there's no external rules here. There's no obligations in general in matter. Of course, he's already mentioned the good of others. That I think we need to make sure we understand. So now he moves on, assuming that has been met. That what I'm about to do is with a mindset of what is good for others, and that makes sense because they're accusing him again of being duplicitous. You're saying you can't do this, but you do that. They're the same thing. So why do you get to make those choices? But if he has the freedom to do or not to do, then they can't judge him. And again, I assume that Paul has already put those to the test already. So what does Paul say about eating meat purchased in the marketplace? We finally get back to our question. Paul's rule is simple. What is it? Eat anything sold in the marketplace. Eat anything that's sold in the marketplace. The word here is markelon, M-A-R-K-E-L-L-O-N. Some of your, probably the King James Version has the shambles. Robin and I, when we were in Great Britain in 2004, visited the shambles, and that's where the meat markets were. And just all these markets there. And he says to do so without raising questions of conscience. Listen, by and large, in ancient times, meat cutters or butchers were priests. I mean, who's cutting up the meat in Judaism or under the law? The priests were. They were the butchers. They were the meat. They are the ones that did the slaughtering. And it doesn't matter, Paul says. It's regardless of whether this meat was sacrificed or not. What Paul's saying is, you buy it in over here. You can't assume. You shouldn't assume that it was offered to an idol. It's there. It's for sale. And so he tells them, go buy and eat. And don't worry about it. And do so without raising questions of conscience. And the Jews probably felt like they needed to ask, was this meat offered to a sacrifice to an idol for their conscience? And Paul is telling the Corinthians, you don't have to ask that question. It's not necessary. Listen, if a person has a conscience that they have to do that, what should they do? They should ask the question. They should ask the question. But meat is meat, Paul is basically saying here, buy and eat. And the implication here is because God doesn't care about that meat that you're buying, you shouldn't care either. So, and again, you go back to the statement, see if I can find it here. Probably the problem is I'm in chapter 11 and I can't find it there. Verse 26. The earth is the Lord's and the fullness of it. It's his. It's all his. Okay? And that's the basis upon which he's doing that. Again, he's assuming, we've already passed verse 24, that person is not seeking his own good, but the good of his neighbor when he goes to the market to buy this food. So what then does Paul mean here by for conscience sake? He's not meaning, and he's not trying to get the Corinthians to pretend to stick their head in the sand like an ostrich and don't investigate, and consequently, because you haven't investigated, you don't have to worry about your conscience, which, by the way, is the way I've always interpreted this before. Don't ask. If you don't ask, then you don't know. It's like forgiveness is easier to get than permission. Okay? If I go ahead and do this and I don't ask about it, if it's wrong, well, then I can always be forgiven later. If I ask ahead of time, then the answer might not be the one I want. And so I'm going to the meat market, and I don't even want to know the sign over the top, Jupiter's Meat Market or whatever it is. I just coming in head down, I see a nice piece of meat, I'll take this one, wrap it up for me and go away, and don't ever look at that. And listen, if I take that meaning that Paul is wanting them not to ask, just go ahead and buy it, that would assume that Paul is addressing the weak, wouldn't it? That Paul's trying to help the weak get their meat without asking. And thus that the real issue is conscience, and here's how to avoid it. And so we're kind of a ignorance is bliss approach to this whole thing. And that, I think, misses Paul's point altogether. Paul is saying that conscience should not be involved at all. Eating this meat is not a matter where your conscience should be engaged or be concerned. This eating of this meat lies outside the realm of conscience. I mean, I can't think of how many ways I can put this. And again, I might underscore that is the way it is in God's eyes from chapter 8 and verse 8. And right there earlier, the earth is the Lord's and the fullness of it. And again, it may be different for the conscience of some from chapter 8 and verse 7, but here's this cow. Whose cow is it in reality? God's. Somehow this cow, in its processing, found its way into this meat market. Is it still God's cow? Yes. And it's still his blessing? Yes. The processing of the meat, from getting from point A to point B, shouldn't matter. Yes?
Do you think that he's pointing out here that this whole matter of eating meat is just a distraction from what's really important, that we need to do all to the glory of God and put others before ourselves?
I think that's the spin that we put on it. Because how many of us are worried about whether our meat was offered to an idol or not? So we expand it to try to go to the principle. This is a real issue here. And so he's having to deal with something that they're very much having to face on a daily, weekly basis. Yeah.
I think when he brings conscience into it, it makes it a psychological thing. Because like you said, when the cow goes from being a cow to being a steak, nothing, even if it goes through the temple, nothing has intrinsically happened to the meat that will now, if you eat it and not know it, will put you in a sinful state.
Right.
It's all up here in your mind.
Right. And again, the difference, what makes the big difference here is whether I'm eating it at home or someplace else, and I'm eating it in the temple, in the celebration of that idol, and in a sense of worshiping there, or fellowship there, yes.
It's no different for us, I believe, than it was for Israel. When they were given the law, it was given to identify sin, and to show them it was exceedingly sinful in what they would have to do. For us today, we're not under that law, but when we're told that we know that that was sacrificed to an idol, it becomes sin if we eat it. And we're conscious of that.
Right.
So it's no different. If we know we can't do that.
Right.
And, your point, we can't cause our brother to stumble in that also.
Right. So the setting makes all the difference. The intent makes all the difference. Is there anything intrinsically evil with the sexual relationship? No, in fact, what did God say in the end of Genesis 1? It's good. It was good. Now, what if I take that relationship and take it outside of marriage? Now we're talking a whole different, same thing, but a whole different relationship. So if I eat meat, not in relationship to an idol or in a pagan temple, that's wrong. If I eat meat in the other situation, it's okay because that's permitted by God.
If you've got that meat unwrapped and then you realize on the back of the paper it says Jupiter, offer to Jupiter, if nobody else is around, you know again that meat is, there's no such
Right.
thing, and you can continue to eat it. But if your friend is there and sees this, then you're supposed to step back. Is that the concept that he's getting?
If he's going to have an issue with it.
For his
Yeah, yeah. Well, and we'll get to that part in a minute because I have a whole different view on that now too. Sorry, I'm just like being turned inside out theologically here. In this study, everything that I thought was just no, that makes perfect sense. I look at it, that doesn't make any sense. So anyway, so again. Understanding the conscience is underscored in verse 26. The reason for Paul's liberal stance here in this area of freedom is the quote that he makes there of Psalm 24:1, that everything is the Lord's. So, listen, if I can thank God for the food that I'm about to eat, then that's great. If I fail to do so, that defrauds God of his glory because he's the one that's providing it for me. And so the rabbis would have expected that you've already investigated and found that the food was kosher and then thank him. And Paul that's how they would interpret verse 26. And Paul is taking the same text and saying, all food is the Lord's. The fullness of it comes from him. He's the source of all of it. And even he's the source of what's sold in the marketplace, and the shambles there. And so Paul is saying the original source of all food is God. Doesn't matter who butchered it or where it appeared in the line of it being processed. When you finally get possession of it, thank God for it, because he's the one that gave it to you. Yes?
Isn't it the same thing Peter had to learn when the sheep was let down?
Yes?
And he was told, kill and eat.
Right.
Peter said, not so. And God said, what I call clean, don't you call unclean.
Right.
It's the same scenario.
Right. And so Paul is saying that meat that was butchered at the Mercury meat shop is called clean by God.
And if your friend says, oh no, that was sacrificed to whatever God of the day would happen to be in the temple, then for his sake.
Now you're getting right back in Mike's car with him, and I'm telling you, you're in the wrong vehicle. Okay?
Open the door and
I hope to do that. And apparently, all my hopes aren't happening. I've got 3 or 4 more pages of notes. So listen, nothing contaminates food in the way or by who it was processed. It's still going to be God's provision for us. So far, Paul has covered 2 of the 3 ways a person might eat meat sacrificed to idol. The first one is you eat meat sacrificed to idol in a pagan temple. What does he say about that? Don't do it. The other way is, which by the way, let me point back up. That would be like going to, today, for us, pretty much like going to most people would look at that like going to a restaurant. That's Sizzler. That's Outback. Because that's where you had the steak. That's where they cooked it and stuff. And so people liked that. And Paul said, you can't. That's the table of demons. You can't go there. The other way that he's offered is, besides the idol temple, is where? In your own home. That you purchase it and you take it to your own home, and not caring or asking about its history, and the answer whether you can eat that or not is yes. So now there's a third venue. And the third venue here is you are invited to dinner by who?
An unbeliever.
By an unbeliever. Chances are, I think that we can guess that the unbeliever here is not going to be a Jewish unbeliever, because he's not going to be buying this food at a marketplace that's been, where the meat perhaps has come from that. So, and I'm assuming here, and again, let's look at verses 20 through 22. No, I imply that what pagans sacrifice they offer to demons and not to God. I do not want you to be participants with demons. You cannot partake the cup of the Lord and the cup of demons. Okay, so we already took care of that. That's why I'm reading wrong. Chapter 9, verses 21 through 22. To the Jews I became a Jew in order to win Jews. To those under the law as under the law. To those outside the law as one outside the law. To the weak I become weak, etc., etc. So from that, if an unbeliever, an unbelieving Gentile, an unbelieving pagan, invites me to come to their home, am I free to go there? Absolutely I am. It's up to me. It's my choice. I don't have to go. Listen, you can invite me and I don't have to go. Okay? It's one of those things. Now, if he's going to invite me to go to the temple with him and have it, I can say no. I can't go there, because Paul has already expressly forbidden that. You cannot do that. So here we're safe to assume that we've been invited to an unbeliever's home. An unbeliever has invited you to dinner. So we're going to sit down, and what does Paul say to do? When we get there, what do? Eat what is put before you. And do I have to ask about it? No, I don't have to ask about it. So it's not a matter of my conscience, nothing I have to be concerned about. But he does have a proviso, or another side here that he's going to talk about in verse 29. And I know we're not going to finish this, but I want you to get started on it so you can be thinking about it for a week. So in verse 28, starting in verse 28. So he's asked you've been invited to his house for dinner. Again, we know we're not in the temple. We know it's not a Jewish unbeliever. And you're disposed to go, so you're going to eat whatever is set before you without raising any questions of good conscience. But if someone says to you, this has been offered in sacrifice, then do not eat it for the sake of the one who informed you and for the sake of conscience. I do not mean your conscience, but his. For why should my liberty be determined by someone else's conscience? Oh, let me read verse 30 with that. If I partake with thankfulness, why am I denounced because of that for which I gave thanks or give thanks? So, Paul again has given two examples of personal liberty that are in this adiaphora, things that aren't commanded or forbidden, things that exist outside of the moral categories, things that are indifferent to God. These are things that are indifferent to him that he shared with us. Not everyone would agree with that person, but these are things he believes are in that category. So the first one we already talked about, it's okay. The second one, now I'm invited into some unbeliever's home, and I'm disposed to go and disposed to eat, and so I should just go ahead and eat it. Eat whatever is set before you without inquiring about it. Listen, you and I do this all the time. You invite me to your house, I'm going to say, okay, before we start eating, did you get this at Fred Meyer? Because I will not eat anything from Fred Meyer. Or did you get this at SARS? Or, who does that? What store did this come from? We don't do that. Paul's saying they don't have to do it either. You don't have to ask. Did you get this at the farmer's market, or did you buy it off the street from a black market corn cob seller? You don't have to ask that question. You don't have to ask for their shopping list. None of those things. But he does place limits on his liberty, and that's in this last example in certain conditions. So what does he say happens here in verse 28? Somebody read the first part of verse 28.
But if someone says to you, this has been offered in sacrifice.
Okay, so stop right there. Does a different translation have it differently than that? If someone says to you, this has been offered in sacrifice. Pardon me?
To idols.
Okay, in sacrifice to idols.
If anyone says.
If anyone, okay. And I think it's anyone. I think it's actually someone. Go ahead.
Is verse 28 in the context of eating in another person's home,
Yes.
not necessarily a general idea.
No.
You're sitting at your own table and somebody walks by and says, I know where you got that.
Yeah.
No, this fits in somebody.
Right. Here's Dan May. I've been asked to come to Eddie Pagan's home for a meal. Okay? And Eddie Pagan has invited Billy Idol to come to dinner too. And Billy Idol knows that I might have a scruple about eating meat sacrificed to idols, that he might think that I that I should be informed about this. This someone is not the host. I think if it was the host, he would have told me before I was coming. So the host is having me over, he's fixing this. Another person there is informing me that this has been sacrificed to idol. Now, why would they do that? The host probably knows me too, and wouldn't have put that in front of me or tested me that way. This guy here is looking out for me. He's trying to do me a favor. By the way, this came from the Jupiter meat market. Okay? Now, I hope that I've just created a billion questions in your mind, and we're going to take those up next week. I don't see how it can be any other way. That especially from what follows, because it's not my conscience that's being affected here. Do I have a conscience about eating this meat that's been sacrificed to an idol that he got at the market or anywhere else? I'm not in the temple, so I have no conscience at all. So there's some other reason why I'm refusing to eat. Okay, and you can puzzle that out for the next week. Yes.
It seems weird to me in some ways, but it's a very particular kind of scenario. But there was a time when I was at a family home, they were Dominican, they took all sorts of different things, and they had made a beverage on the stove, hot beverage, had all sorts of weird stuff thrown in it, and they served it to all of us, and they served me coffee. I said, oh wow, this is very good, what's in it, They told me some of the things, oh wow, very good. And then someone else kind of whispered in my ear, I told them there's a lot of alcohol in there.
Right.
And it's a very similar situation where it's like the person saying that to me clearly is telling me that for a reason.
Right.
And it reflects something about their view of the alcohol.
Right.
So that, of course,
And that you might have had a scruple against that.
right.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a perfect example of what I think is going on here. I had the same thing happen when I was working the meat shop around Christmas time. We're selling all kinds of stuff, and the other meat cutters in the store, they loved alcohol all the time, and they would try to get it in. Well, so one of them had brought in a big thing of 7-Up, and probably spiked with vodka or something. And I'm just running dry and hot. I'm running everywhere I go, and one of them handed it to me and said, "This is good." And I tried, boy, this is really good, And somebody else told me that had alcohol in it. So I didn't have any more of it. I wasn't worried about it because I'm not drunk, but they just stepped in and said, by the way, you probably, because they knew that I didn't do that. So, and I think that's a perfect example of what's going on here. And I'll explain why I think that next week. Okay?
So really better so you could become a priest.
What?